Thanks, Marcy. Nice to be back at the KVR. So the last couple of years when I've been in charge of these programs, I've traveled around the state and I've given lots of talks on wolves, lots of talks on cougars, lots of talks on black bears, but never all three together. So I showed up at the reserve mid-afternoon today and put 3 talks together, 126 slides. No, I pared it down a wee bit. So we've got a lot to cover. The carnivore community in Wisconsin, of course, is real diverse, includes lots of cool species, the weasels, raccoons, foxes, coyotes, skunks, things like that, but I'm going to focus on the large carnivores. The DNR, in terms of management, separates these 3 species, wolves, black bears, and cougar, from the other, not because ecologically they're really distinct, they're in the same order, Carnivora, but because the way they interface with us can be quite different. Would you rather see this in your backyard or this? All right? So the management of those large carnivore species brings with it a lot more challenges, and I'll talk about primarily those 3 species here tonight. We've got quite a bit of information to relate, but the best part, I think, of coming to these talks is the ability to raise your hand and say, hey, Mr. DNR guy, you're full of whatever, or have a question, comment, anything. Bring it up and we'll, Marcy said as long as I'm home by midnight, I'm good to go, right? One of the things that a lot of our wildlife species, but especially these large carnivore species, have in common is their history on the population level really reflects our social fabric, our perceptions, opinions, ideals with respect to natural resources. Their ranges throughout the 18 and early 1900s contracted greatly. And these are just 3 maps that show the historic range, in this case for black bears, the gray area, and overlaid by the current range, the dark gray area. And you see this massive range contraction, right? There were black bears all the way down to the southern tip of Florida, much less expansive now. Cougars, the same thing. We recognize cougars in our lifetime as a species of the western United States. Formerly, they were all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And the same thing largely on the right for the gray wolf, or wolves. Occupied most of the lower 48 states prior to our arrival, now just in the northern Rockies and the upper Midwest. We're really, depending on your point of view, fortunate here in Wisconsin to have wild country that all 3 of these species today can be found in. It's a good thing or a bad thing, I think, depending on your point of view. So what happened? Well, remember 4th grade history class when we learned about manifest destiny, westward expansion? It was our God-given right to colonize lands to the west, the Midwest, on into the western states and convert them to our uses. Predators were simply an obstacle to that progress, right? So they were a hindrance, a nuisance. These animals were vermin to be eliminated on sight. We had poisoning, strychnine-laced baits, predator control programs, aerial gunning eventually, bounties. We had bounties on gray wolves in Wisconsin until 1957, fairly recently, right? So it's these efforts, it's us that push these critters into the wildest mountaintops out in the Rocky Mountains, back up into Canada, etc. Throughout the mid-1900s, and a lot of credit comes back here to Wisconsin for this, some forward-thinking conservationists like Aldo Leopold, Sigurd Olson. Prior to that, John Muir started to wonder if this elimination of these critters was a good thing or not. And we started to consider the impacts of westward expansion, the impacts humans were having on the landscape, and whether or not critters like these 3 didn't deserve a place out there on the landscape. So the conservation ethic started to pervade our consciousness. Probably best exemplified by a little quiz. What seminal piece of 1973 federal legislation? Endangered Species Act, where our government, instead of paying bounties and supporting predator control, banned the taking of endangered species. That allowed these three, or at least two of these three critters, to rebound. Okay? So sort of a common theme there. I'm going to step through, starting with black bears, because they're the least controversial, perhaps. When I talk on wolves, the temperature in the room can just turn downright cold, right? So we'll start with big fuzzy black bears, okay? And I'll touch on a few interesting, I think, aspects of the species ecology, but focus really on their current population status in the state and the way the DNR manages them. We all recognize black bears, right? The only bear found in eastern North America, one of three bears native to North America, the polar bear, the brown bear, the others. Most of my experience, actually, and I can give you a lot of cool stories when we're done here, and I finally get that beer, is working with polar bears up in the Arctic. But black bears in Wisconsin, most of our bears are black. Black bears will come in blonde phase, brown phase, cinnamon phase. Almost all of our bears are black, with the occasional brown or cinnamon phase bear mixed in, and most of our bears, or about half our bears, have some sort of white marking on the chest. A big boar, a big male polar bear, will top 500 pounds in the state, with a massive monster going over 700 pounds. We had one 700-pound bear harvested this past bear season here in the state. Sows, maybe 60-70% of that size, but incredible animals. Our most common large carnivore in the state, and the only one that's been with us continuously, as we'll see cougar and wolves at one point were gone from the state. They can be very long-lived animals. This is a sow that was tagged as part of a study in Minnesota. She lived to be just about 40 years old. In states like Wisconsin, with a harvest season and a lot of dedicated hunters, there likely aren't bears that live that long. Their lifespans tend to be limited by harvest, but can be very long-lived animals. To step through their annual cycle quickly, winter, of course, is a time we generally don't see black bears out on the landscape. They're hibernating in dens, and we tend to think of bear dens as always in caves or some excavated burrow. They do use those habitats for denning, but they use a lot of other types of dens. Many of them actually just den. They sort of rake together a nest, and they den right on the ground. I talked to grouse hunters, rough grouse hunters up north, who report walking through the woods hunting grouse, and there's a bear sleeping on a pile of leaves in the middle of the woods. And occasionally, though, even den up in eagle nests, right? As that bear there is doing, okay? So they use a variety of structures for denning. While in the den, of course, the sows give birth sometime around the first of the year. Cubs, those cute little guys, tiny, a half pound to a pound at birth. Though they grow massively quickly, within 8 months, they can top 80 or 90 pounds, so they grow very quickly. And they stay with their mother through a second winter, through a second denning season, so about a year and a half. Born with mom in the den one winter, spend the summer and fall with her, and then den with her as yearlings the next winter before they disperse sometime mid-June, July the following summer. Aren't they cute? One of the cool things about bears, about black bears, something called delayed implantation. Who's heard of this? Handful of you. It's one of the cool things about the black bear reproductive cycle, and it allows these animals to breed when food is abundant and allows the sows to go into the denning season with lots of body fat. Most large animals like bears, like white-tailed deer in Wisconsin, when are they breeding? Right during the fall rut. Then that female is caring for that developing fetus throughout the winter. Bears breed actually midsummer. Fairly truncated breeding period, just a couple weeks long in July. When that egg divides a number of times and develops into what we call a blastocyst, basically just a little hollow sphere of cells, it stops developing. It goes essentially into suspended animation, floats around in the uterus for the rest of the summer until about the period when that sow enters the den. Then it comes out of suspended animation, continues development, and birth occurs sometime probably shortly after the first of the year. Okay? So delayed implantation. Why? Well, this allows, again, the female to go through the period of heavy eating hyperphagia just before denning, fatten up, and it allows males to do the same thing without going through an energetically demanding rut or breeding period right in the fall. So they can breed and then fatten up so they're able to survive the following winter. Yep?
So are females that are going to have a litter more likely to den underground as opposed to on a pile of leaves?
Yes, and they also den a little bit earlier. Sows with cubs are the first bears to enter the dens. Who's heard that bears don't hibernate? 5 years ago, 10 years ago, ecologists said bears don't truly hibernate. They're not like ground squirrels that drop their body temperature nearly to freezing, almost stop breathing, have a very slow heart rate. Nowadays, we consider bears to be true hibernators. They don't lower their metabolic rate, their activity, to the same extent some other hibernators do, like ground squirrels, but they still do truly hibernate. And there you see a couple photos of bears hibernating in their den. But what takes place during hibernation in bears is right now being intensively studied. What happens to us if we lay on our bed for 4 months, 5 months, sometimes 6 months and do nothing? We deteriorate, our bodies fall apart, right? Muscles atrophy, our bones weaken, osteoporotic, things like that. Bears, none of that happens. They maintain strong muscles, strong bones. They've got all these cool adaptations to hibernation. Calcium, instead of being excreted as bone breaks down, is continually recycled to maintain their bones. Their amino acids given off via protein metabolism are just converted to new muscle protein. They don't drink, urinate, defecate. Through fat metabolism, as they burn off their fat, they create water, and that's essentially what they live on. Okay? They're actually studying this as a way, perhaps, to get humans to Mars, right? To allow humans to enter some sort of, you guys have seen Aliens, right? That idea, humans to enter some sort of hibernation state to allow them to survive a long trip to Mars. In spring, after that period of hibernation, they emerge from their dens and they start looking to feed. For a couple weeks, though, they can't really effectively digest food. Their digestive system is essentially shut down. So for a period, they're active, walking around, nibbling on some things, but it's not for, a week or two before they really become active feeders. They emerge April to May here in Wisconsin. Primarily, they feed along wetland edges, areas where you get that big spring green up, a lot of nice, moist, nutritious vegetation. They're carnivores, but black bears, most of their diet, say 90%, is actually vegetation, right? Taxonomically, they're carnivores. When they come out of their dens, they're looking for food, and what are we hanging in our backyards this time of year? Bird feeders, suet. So we see a big spike in nuisance bear cases, nuisance bear issues, when the bears come out of their dens every spring. Anybody know what that is? The technical name is the meconium. It's one of the most attractive things in nature. It's the fecal plug. Throughout hibernation, the matter in the bear's digestive tract becomes condensed and packed and dried out right at their anus, and it shuts their digestive system down. When they exit the den, I don't know why I chose to show this picture, but when they leave the den in spring, it's one of the signs that bears are recently active on the landscape. You find these big piles of bear poop, or the fecal plugs. And of course, they find those bird feeders in the backyard, and they will do whatever they have to do to get that bird seed. Okay. One of the issues, I know, that's an emotive photograph, but one of the issues we face with black bears or any other predators on the landscape, hunters know that black bears this time of year, they do not prey on adult deer, but of course they will feed on any fawns that they find when the fawns are dependent soon after fawning. This gives hunters the impression bears are reducing deer numbers. So I just wanted to show this picture and explain what we know about bear predation on deer. They're opportunistically finding these fawns. Large predators, wolves and bear, will eat fawns, but they don't actively search for them. They're too large. Fawns are 6 to 8 pound fawns. They're too small to sustain them given the energy it takes to course through the landscape to look for them. Other predators like bobcats, coyotes may actively search for fawns because to them it's energetically worth it. Nonetheless, bears do pick off fawns as they encounter them, but probably not to the level where it puts the deer population at risk. Okay. In summer, bears go through a couple things. First of all, of course, the mating period. The clock resets there in early July, but also dispersal. The cubs that were born not the previous winter, but the winter before, mom is now going to breed again, and she basically kicks her yearling cubs out of the nest. Those cubs then have to find a territory of their own. If they're female cubs, they settle near mom. The young female bears don't disperse long distances. They may again establish a territory right near mom, but the males can go a long way. And it's these males who's heard of or seen themselves a black bear here in the hills, southwest Wisconsin, right? It's usually those males that end up popping up well out of established black bear range, okay? We kept track of that for a while in the DNR, and all these dots are black bear sightings across southern Wisconsin, including cubs. This star is a sow with cubs that a decade ago was observed down in Grant County. So the bears are here. I was talking about this before we started tonight with someone in the back of the room. How many of you remember 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, hearing of bears in the driftless? Why aren't numbers building? Why don't we have an established breeding population? Why are they still such a rarity? It's likely because of this sex-biased dispersal. We get quite a few bears, young bears wandering into the area, but the females aren't moving. So it's a rarity to have a female bred and reproducing this far south in the state. But they're coming, make no mistake. Okay, in the fall, bears switch their diet largely to mast, hard and soft mast, nuts and berries, things like that. Years where the oak trees go to tops, as they say, where they're producing abundant acorns, that's great for bears. Very energetically rich food, those acorns, they're laying on fat very quickly. It actually impacts hunters because when there are a lot of acorns out in the woods, bears aren't as likely to come in to bear baits, right? In many years, though, we have what's called a mast failure, where the oak trees really don't produce acorns. That can be so nutritionally deleterious to the sows that they're not able to breed. They've already bred, but they're not able to develop those cubs to birth. So they'll abort the fetuses. And what that leads to actually is synchronized breeding. Sows breed only every other year, and given those acorn bust years, all sows tend to breed in the same years, or there's that tendency. Of course, they're feeding like crazy to build up their fat reserves. And one of the things they turn to during the milk stage in late July through August is corn, right? And bear damage in cornfields, I don't know if anybody's seen this, it's not like deer damage. They sit on their big fat butts and they just pull stalks of corn into them. And they just move outward in these ever-expanding rings. And of course that leads to issues with farmers And who gets the phone call? Yep. Black bear range is expanding in the state. And what I've plotted here, so of course the DNR keeps harvest records by county over time for black bears. In 1977, the dark blue counties in the north, that's the only place we harvested a black bear. 20 years later, 1997, we'd added a few counties here throughout the central part of the state. 20 years later, we were harvesting black bears right down here to Vernon County, okay? We've seen that, and many of you have seen a bear, and know somebody who has. Here's a photo of a black bear in Mount Horeb, one in La Crosse. We've had them on the reserve. We've had them in my valley down near Viola. What's wrong with this picture? Yeah, this is not, as bears move southward, we need to learn how to live with them, right? Give them respect. Give them their distance. That's not what you do with bears, right? But at any rate, they're moving southward, and we've got to learn, if they're coming, how to live with bears. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Bears are a prize trophy game species in the state. Who's hunted bear? Who's waited a decade for one bear permit? Yeah. We have 120,000 people applying for bear permits each fall in Wisconsin. We hand out 11 or 12,000 permits a year, so there's a lot of demand. But as a wildlife manager, they're a frightening species to manage simply because the sows only breed every other year. They have on average around 3 cubs, very low reproductive rate. What happens if the state's bear biologist allows an overharvest to occur? Population's pushed to a low level. They're not coming back. That's going to be a black eye on me for a decade because of their low reproductive rates. So controlling harvest is important, and we very, very closely monitor the size and health of our bear population. If you're a bear hunter, you know you have to extract a vestigial premolar from a bear you harvest, send it in to us. Just like aging a tree from its rings, you can take a section of that tooth, count the rings, and age the bear. We use aged harvest models, some mathematical models then, to predict the size of the bear population, okay? And here it's depicted last year by bear management zone. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So we get an estimate anyway of the number of bears in the state and in each different zone. If you've had elementary stats, you know that those are fairly wide confidence intervals. So there's always some uncertainty in our population estimates and the harvest quotas that we then recommend. But the nice thing about these models, not only does it tell us how many bears we have, it tells us where the bear population in that zone is tending, downward, upward, stable, and it allows us to predict a few years into the future under various quota levels. So if we harvest 785 bears in Zone B, we're likely to have a stable population over the next couple of years. If we harvest 1,300 in Zone D, we're likely to allow that population some modest increase, okay? Point I want to make here is there's a lot of really highbrow mathematics behind bear management in the state, and it's all aimed at allowing recreational harvest, yet protecting the bears themselves. As I alluded to, we do manage by zone right now. Bear management zone A, north central part of the state. B, C is everything south essentially of Highway 64, and D in the northwest. That's going bye-bye in about a year. We just wrote a revised version of our bear management plan. Our Natural Resources Board and legislature now have approved a new structure to our bear zones. Couple changes up here in the north to allow us to better address those agricultural concerns, crop damage issues, but for importance down here, we've taken Zone C and split it into 3 zones that better reflect variation in bear habitat, forest cover in this case, you get, in my mind, south of Green Bay, east of Madison, give it to Illinois. Okay? Yeah, darn right. There's no bear habitat down there. So we don't want to constrain bear populations and hunting opportunity in other areas of the South by the lack of habitat down there. So we're going to treat that differently. Central forest, big blocks of habitat and public land here, that'll be separated. But we're also carving out the driftless area. That allows us to determine independently where we want our local bear population to go. If we want bears, they're coming, right? Do we want to allow them to come, breed, and build in number? As a landowner, John and Rita, do you want to see bears out your back window? Yes, John does. Thumbs up. But you can imagine the concerns. People who aren't used to living with black bears, bear in their backyard is something to be frightened of, right? A farmer who's seen photographs of that crop damage up north, bears in my, no way, right? So there's a lot of social issues that we're going to have to confront, a lot of public education and outreach if we're going to establish bears in this part of the state. But I will tell you, if the sun were up and we looked out that window, we would see wonderful black bear habitat. They would do just fine here. Would we have problems with them? Oh yeah. They'd eat a little corn, they'd cause some issues. John, they'd tear down your bird feeder. But the habitat is good for bears, okay? The models we use to predict bear numbers don't tell us exactly how many bears are out there. It's an estimate. The problem with models is over time, you may be underestimating black bear numbers or overestimating black bear numbers and not know it. In other words, you're constantly modeling on data that's biased, right? So what we do, who remembers the tetracycline study? We use tetracycline to mark and estimate bear numbers. We can't use tetracycline any longer. The FDA won't allow us. So what we just initiated last year is a non-invasive genetic capture mark recapture population estimator. CMR techniques are a century old in wildlife. It's our most basic way to estimate wildlife numbers. But what we did this past summer, we put out 800, I didn't have a thing to do with it. I sit in an office and stare at a computer. But the guys that do the cool stuff were out in the woods installing 844 hair snares across Bear Range in Wisconsin. So it's just a strand of barbed wire, 18 inches off the ground below which cubs can move. We don't want to mark cubs. We don't want to sample cubs because they're not harvestable. They're illegal to harvest, so we won't recapture them during the fall hunting season. But as an adult bear crosses, we catch the little hair on the fence, we collect it very diligently, rubber gloves, with a torch we burn all residual DNA off the strand. We send that then to a lab in Pennsylvania. They run the DNA and give us a genetic fingerprint for each of those bears. During the hunting season then, who bear hunted this past fall? You had to send in 2 teeth, right? Well, sorry. So you came here to complain, right? This past fall, those that did harvest bear had to send in a 2nd tooth. We took that tooth, cracked it, extracted the pulp. We're running the DNA, or the lab's running the DNA right now, so we can identify bears that had been marked in the summer from those that hadn't, and use those data to estimate bear numbers. That'll allow us to bring our model back into reality, right? An actual direct estimate of bear numbers. A lot of work going on out there. And of course, bears, like the other large carnivores, bring with them negative impacts on human activities, bird feeders. If you're a beekeeper, bears love honey. Winnie the Pooh was exactly right. Big impacts on apiaries. I talked about the corn damage. This is something we have to deal with, right? Wildlife are in the public trust. It's a DNR responsibility. Even bears that just wander into backyards can lead to panicked phone calls from the residents. This is your bear, Scott Walter. Your job is to come out and do something. Lady, my wife needs me at home for dinner tonight. The kids have basketball practice. But I'll call somebody for you, right? So we've got our, what we call our wildlife damage abatement and claims program that addresses all these issues. We work with our colleagues in the United States Department of Agriculture. We've got dozens upon dozens of culvert traps. When there's an issue, we go out, we trap these bears, we move them. In some cases, we issue shooting permits to the farmer or landowner for lethal control. The green dots here, I'll just point out, that's crop damage. That's essentially corn damage. And if you remember our new zones, we're changing zone D so that it looks like this, trying to address that crop damage up north. Real quick, I should have been halfway through wolves by now, but you guys are having fun, right? So farmers around here, as we allow bears to come in, they're going to be really concerned because they've seen those pictures of a cornfield annihilated. My feeling is we're not going to see that level of concentrated damage in this part of the state. Why? If you look up in this area, my brothers and I grouse hunt on the Rusk County Forest. It's big blocks of forest with a dairy farm here and there. Those cornfields are drawing in bears from all over hell and beyond because it's the only corn on the landscape. We translocated, forget the number, but something like 47 bears out of one cornfield in Sawyer County this year. Okay? And the landowner, last I heard, it had minimal damage because we were able to get in there right as the damage started to occur. Down here, every bear, a male bear, a boar is going to have a territory 15 to 20 square miles in size. Every one of those bears is going to have multiple cornfields within its home range. They're all going to be feeding on corn, but in a very diffuse, dispersed manner. Okay, so I don't think we'll see the concentrated damage. Are they going to eat corn? Absolutely. Are they going to eat as much as our deer eat? No way. Okay? All a matter of perspective. So we got to learn to live with bears, right? Bears generally avoid humans. They have no interest in us. What they have an interest in is eating. So if we have anything in our environment that's attractive to bears, the brats you flipped on the grill during the Packer game that squirted grease all over hell and beyond, bird feeders, garbage cans. This bear's walking off with a dog food dish off the back deck, right? You'll bring them in. So learning to live with bears is learning how to maintain that line between them and us. Removing the attractants usually solves the issue. Okay? Moving on to wolves, but if you want to learn more about bears and how we manage them, like I said, just this past May, I went to the Natural Resource Board with this, a revision to our 10-year black bear management plan, all kinds of goodies on bears, and what our 10-year goals are for the population. So this is on our website. We'll have print copies available shortly here, but it's a good read if you're a wildlife nerd like me. All right, let's move on to wolves. Okay? Hands in the air if you see this picture and you think, what a wonderful, beautiful, majestic wildlife species. Hands in the air if you look at this picture and you say, ugh, no way, not in my backyard. Wolves are contentious, right? I'll talk about that. The social fabric that weaves through wolf management is honestly one of the things that attracted me to this position, to that position now, right? We have to make decisions, important decisions about where we want wolves and how many wolves we want in the state. Making those decisions requires bringing those of you who initially raised your hand with those of you who raised your hand after together, right? Understanding each other and trying to find some middle ground. Because bottom line, these are just big coyotes. They're just another wildlife species. They're as interesting, as beautiful, as involved in their wild community as any other animal species. It's the way we view them and their impacts on us that sets them apart. So it's complex. The attitudes, like in this room, run the gamut. From folks that love wolves and scream at the DNR because in the past we've allowed hunting seasons. We'll talk about why we don't currently have a season in Wisconsin. Shame on Wisconsin. To those who would just as soon all wolves drop dead right now. Okay? The only good wolf is a dead wolf. Improve your forest, shoot a wolf, kill wolves. Very, very, very emotive situation. But in the middle sits wolves. Okay? We've got to find a way to get these people together. The DNR always talks about science-based management, right? We base our decisions on science. We know a ton about this critter. We know about its ecology. We know about population dynamics, the way it interacts with other species. This is the stuff I spend my days reading. Journal articles, books, wolves. We know about wolves. If we could make decisions based solely on science, my job would be easy and maybe a little boring, right? Because it's the social views behind wolf management that to me are really fascinating. We'll talk a little bit about these in just a second. If you're a deer hunter, and we'll see this, you know that wolves eat deer. Wolves are vermin. That was my 12-point buck. I didn't see any deer opening weekend because there are wolves in the area. We'll talk about that viewpoint in a bit. Maybe you're a farmer. You lost a head of livestock to wolves. Very direct impact hits you in the pocketbook. Obviously, going to be concerned. I know these pictures are graphic, but this happens in the woods all the time when wolves are present. Maybe you lost a hunting dog. Maybe you just saw a wolf and it initiated a fear response and you're reacting emotively because of that. Maybe you grew up thinking wolves, you've never seen a wolf. You've never even set foot in the woods where wolves live. But you grew up viewing them as the symbol of wilderness. You're a member of the Sierra Club and wolves are on the cover and they're beautiful, wonderful. We've got to protect wolves. So that skews your views. All those views are important, but it's hard to meld them together. In September of this year, so until Friday, I was going to have to lead stakeholder groups, the citizens of the state of Wisconsin, through a consensus building activity to make decisions about wolf management. Right now, the state of Washington is going through that same process. They canceled, this is how vitriolic wolf management can be. They had to cancel 6 public hearings because their staff were getting death threats. Right?
From wolves?
From wolves. Yeah. From this wolf, this is the mugshot, right? But that's how contentious the issue can be. And I just think we can simply do better than that. All right? Whoops, wrong slide. No. Maybe the most important slide in my talk. So for 10 years I taught at our little university campus here over in Richland Center. And I taught in some semesters environmental science. And I tried to get the students to discuss and debate really contentious issues. Genetically modified organisms, pesticides, hunting. And I wanted them to have an open and respectful dialogue, so I emphasized you will not get there if you adopt Plato's philosophy. So, who's seen this painting before? Who's?
It's Raphael. It's the Vatican. It's the philosophers. Plato and Aristotle.
Yes. And Plato, with his finger pointed to the sky, is proclaiming what? Universalism. They had these great philosophical debates about ethics, right, wrong, truth. What is truth? Values. And Plato always ascribed to universalism. Finger pointed to the sky. If something is right, it should be right for everybody. Something is wrong, it should be universally wrong. Something is held in value, it should be valuable to everybody. If it's valueless, same thing. Aristotle, his students, said, hey, wait, Mr. P, you're way off base. You don't understand that people have different religious beliefs, background, different childhoods, different relationships with their family. Truth, therefore, has to be viewed as a relative concept. Right and wrong has to be viewed as a relative concept, palms down to the ground. It's relativism. Now think about this. Continue to think about this. Anytime you enter into a discussion about, say, a pool at Kickapoo area schools, right? An issue that can be divisive. If you view things as a universalist, then what you believe is absolute, and if somebody disagrees, they are just wrong. Then how do you spend your time? Trying to convince them why they're wrong. And you get frustrated and angry because you don't understand, right? Whereas if we're relativists, hey, Scott's got a view, and I'll tell you my view, but I'll listen to yours too, right? Maybe the folks out in Washington should have taken my environmental science course. You understand how fundamental that is, but how important it is to open, respectful dialogue that gets us to consensus and a decision in the end? All right. Quick history. Did you see that coming, Marcy?
No.
You did not? Okay. Little quick history of wolves in Wisconsin. I talked about westward expansion, the fact we had pushed wolves aside from most of their historic range. There was a point in the 1950s when the gray wolf only existed across the lower 48 states in northeastern Minnesota. They were gone from the Rockies, they were in Canada, but in the lower 48 states, northeast Minnesota. That's very important for us here in Wisconsin, as we'll find out. The endangered species, there were 500 to 700 wolves, we figure, at that time, but they were gone from Wisconsin. The 4,000 to 6,000 we had prior to settlement had been wiped out, as they had from most of their range in the central and southeastern U.S. Okay? Endangered Species Act comes, these wolves stop getting pushed back, and they start making baby wolves, and they start expanding. To the point that in 1978, the first wolves re-entered Wisconsin. Major point, if you're sleeping now, wake up. This is the one question on the quiz at the end of the night. The DNR did not, NOT means negative, did not reintroduce wolves. They made it here on their own. In 1978, a pack was detected in Douglas County. Once they're here, Endangered Species Act, hands off, right? So they did what wolves do, made more wolves. Oh, by the way, the first gentleman to serve as a wolf biologist in Wisconsin, Dick Thiel, lives up in Tolman now actually, but wrote a great book about the rediscovery of wolves, about those years and what it meant to the state and how they discovered. Interestingly enough, Dick had just left or was finishing his bachelor's. He was a 22-year-old kid at UW-Stevens Point. And when I read this, I kept thinking of me and my college buddies with 24 packs of Old Milwaukee on our shoulders, heading off into Douglas County to find wolves. And they did, right? There's reference to beer again. But at any rate, if you're interested, this is a great book. The second edition just came out. When wolves were here, protected by the Endangered Species Act, we couldn't manage them, but it was incumbent upon the DNR to monitor them. So we initiated a very intensive, volunteer-dependent monitoring program. And we still use these tools to estimate wolf numbers today. Winter track surveys, our biologists and 150 volunteers, if you want to get involved, you can. Go out in the woods each winter and look for wolf tracks, count the number of wolves in each pack. We maintain 60 to 75 wolves on the air each year with GPS radio collars like this guy right here. We're able to find those wolves. We're able to estimate pack territory size, count the number of animals in the pack from the air, things like that. We get observations from the public, reports of dead wolves along roads, and also from farmers and others, pet owners, reports of wolf depredations on pets or livestock. All this information we throw into a pot and use to generate our wolf population estimate. And what I'm going to show you right now is the wolf population since its establishment in the late 1970s up to the present. And the map shows the range. You can see for 15 years, they weren't doing well. There were some disease issues. They had problems sort of getting a foothold. But mid-1990s hit, and our population shot skyward. Okay? Central Forest is occupied, the northern third to a half of the state. And last winter, isn't on here, 914 wolves and 243 packs. Few main points. When wolves made it back to Wisconsin, the federal government established a recovery goal. Endangered species, we need some goal to shoot for. Their goal in 1992 was 100 wolves in Wisconsin and the UP of Michigan combined. If we get 100 wolves ever in the UP and Wisconsin, they're recovered, they're good. Our state said we're going to drop them off the threatened list, the state threatened list at 250. Our wolf management plan, as we'll see, says we should have 350 wolves in the state. We are way above that. Our wolf population is not endangered. It is secure. It is healthy. The population dropped for a couple years. This is when wolves were delisted and we had management authority. We had a harvest season. So a little hunting, a little trapping. The other thing I'd point out, massive increase. The last 3 years, our wolf population has stabilized at just over 900 wolves. And just like with bears, any other large carnivore, there are negative consequences to having wolves on the landscape. We lose a bunch of calves every year, 30, maybe as high as 40 some, maybe 20. We lose adult cattle, beef cows, dairy cows, hounds, right? Especially those used to hunt bear because they're hunting bear right up in the heart of wolf range. Lose a handful in most years of pets, sometimes one, sometimes 3 or 4. Often these are pets that are allowed to roam free while their owner's taking a hike through the woods. Sometimes they're snatched right out of backyards. Okay. Sheep depredations are very episodic. In many years, no sheep are killed by wolves, but wolves will get into a pasture occasionally and just go nutty and kill a bunch of sheep. Who heard of read about the 2 big depredations this summer? 40 sheep up in Price County and then 16, 17, whatever it was in Wood County. The reason I put this up here, regardless of your views on wolves, symbol of wilderness, I love wolves, we got to deal with this, right? These are landowners paying, farmers, etc., paying a price for the public wanting wolves on the landscape. So at any rate, my program and a couple others deal with the negative side. We manage wolves according to our state's wolf management plan. I will point out the year, 1999, at which point we set our population goal in Wisconsin should be 350 wolves. We established that goal when we had a couple hundred wolves in the state, and we thought maybe we could hit 550 wolves given our knowledge of habitat, etc. Again, we're at 900. This goal's outdated. Why haven't we revisited it? Because when wolves are listed, when they're federally protected as an endangered species, the state has no management authority. Our legal counsel has advised us if you don't have management authority, you can't plan. You can't make management decisions. So we've not been able to revisit this, essentially, since wolves were, again, federally protected. I've been making this pitch. Previous discussions have really been focused on how many wolves. But when as I mentioned, we've got collars on wolves. We know a lot about these wolves. And we've learned from the radio-collared animals two big things. In the winter, midwinter, before the breeding season, wolves occupy anywhere from 30 to 80 square miles. Say on average 50 square miles, each pack. And each pack contains 4 wolves. Varies almost nil. Some winters, like last winter, 3.8 wolves per pack. Maybe 4.1, but almost always 4.0. Pack size is actually determined by prey size for an interesting reason. But at any rate, that doesn't vary. So what we've learned from wolves in northern Wisconsin, they want to have 4 wolves for every 50 square miles, or 1 wolf for every 12 point whatever square miles. Okay? A wolf pack for every township and a half. They will not go beyond that. They base that density on their food resources. Unless the deer population goes crazy, 4 wolves, 50 square miles. That's the equation. Okay? We need to incorporate that into our planning, because wolves will assort themselves across any geographic area in that fashion. So we can predict how many wolves at wolf equilibrium there will be in Douglas County, Wolf Management Zone 1, the Central Forest, Northern Forest, whatever. Okay? And I think that's got to be included as we discuss future wolf population goals. Because I tell you, if we remain with a goal of 350 across the range wolves currently occupied, where we know there can be 920, our harvests are every year going to have to be massive, not publicly acceptable. It's going to be disrupting to wolf pack structure. It's not going to be a responsible way to manage. 350 is an acceptable goal, but then we have to think about where. And maybe a smaller acceptable range is important. We've done a ton. Is that my beeper? Am I done? We've done a ton of research on wolves. Phil's question asked, where are we going to go in the next few years? Well, maybe a more fundamental question, why have wolf numbers leveled off? The research, Jennifer Stenglein, our biometrician, looked at the data from the 520 some wolves we've collared over the last 3 or 4 decades, ran some survival analyses, and interestingly included a spatial variable to those analyses. And we found, and she did that by mortality factor. So she can essentially look at the risk of a wolf being hit on the road, illegally harvested, whatever, across the state. When it comes to poaching, illegal killing happens very little in the deep, dark forests of isolated northern Wisconsin. As wolves have come closer to us, this is Highway 64, right? More of them die. We kill more of them. More of them also die on highways because there are more highways, more people, more cars. This is the Central Forest here, so Toma would be right about in here, right? Same thing, they get closer to us, they die. So I think we're probably going to continue to see a stable population, but only because they've bumped up against us, right? Average rates of illegal killing across the 4-year time period of Jen's study, 9.4%. Every year, illegal killing takes an average of 1 out of 10 wolves, or almost. And that's concentrated, again, where they're bumping up against us in highways, in corn, etc. Wolves move. So if you saw that map, we have wolves in the Central Forest. We have wolves up north. Why do people see them here in Vernon County, Richland County, etc.? This is a young male my assistant and I put a collar on last year up by Marshfield. You can see the clock ticking. So there's Christmas last year. Here's the first part of this year. Moved all the way up into northeastern Minnesota, found a pack, a little young female wolf he really fell in love with. She said, take a hike. Headed down just north of Lafarge. Walked inside the city limits of Prairie du Sac, where somebody ticked him off, and he headed back north. That wolf is now just outside Minocqua. He's been accepted by a pack. He's doing okay. People don't understand over 800 miles. Straight line distance. People don't often understand the mobility of these wildlife species. And when they see a wolf, I talk to folks like this all the time. When they see a wolf in Grant County, in Walworth County, in Greene, they say, I saw a wolf, the deer are all gonna die, and I'm not letting my kids play outside, right? They sense that there must be wolves everywhere. Usually it's a dispersing male. Okay. All right, I mentioned the social fabric's important. By the way, the cougar chunk, Marcy, is really short. So, in 2014, we conducted a very intensive survey of Wisconsin citizens. What are your attitudes about wolves? How do you want us to manage them, etc. Interestingly, we found out that most Wisconsinites have a favorable or a very favorable attitude about wolves. They like them. Right? There's not an insignificant minority that really don't like them. But more people that live outside of wolf range, meaning Madison, Milwaukee, down here, right, like wolves than do folks that actually live with them. Many more people that live with wolves in wolf range don't like them because perhaps they're feeling the impacts. They've lost a pet. Their neighbors lost a heifer, whatever. We also, interestingly, but not surprisingly, found that attitudes are in part based on whether or not people hunt deer. This was a strong factor in determining public attitudes. So this is, how many wolves do you want in the state? This is the question, right? When we look at deer hunters, 71% said fewer, many fewer, or none. Right? Non-hunters, the majority said, I'm happy now, but if we had a lot more, that's cool too. Right? Whether or not people hunt deer determines their attitudes about wolves. So I want to explore that because, as I mentioned, we have a lot of science. We know a lot about wolves, the way they interact with other species. The problem is, for many people, many deer hunters, it's this simple. Wolves eat deer, wolves bad. Wolves eat deer, therefore deer die, no more deer. Right? It's never that simple in nature. These two species coexisted for millennia before we were here. And when we think about white-tailed deer population dynamics, now wolves are certainly a part of the picture in parts of the state, but there are also other predators. Bears eating fawns, coyotes eating fawns, and maybe the occasional adult deer. Bobcats eating fawns, the occasional adult deer. Habitat quality, are we regenerating our forests? Is there browse in the winter? Winter severity, they had 51 inches of snow last week on the Bayfield Peninsula. Greg Kessler, a friend of mine who's a biologist up in Brule, said the deer the first week in December were snorkeling through the snow with their heads. Okay, that certainly impacts deer. We've got CWD, EHD, other diseases, antlerless harvest control numbers. So it's not wolves annihilate deer. They're part of the picture. Always remember it's more complex than it might seem. If I could go to midnight, we would talk about all of this ecology, this ecological theory that describes these types of relationships. But I do want to talk about a couple, I think, really important ideas. First of all, hunters often assume that communities are regulated in a top-down sense. In other words, wolves control deer numbers and therefore mitigate impacts of deer on habitat. We know that sometimes happen, right? This is called top-down population regulation. Deer hunters who say, wolves just arrived in my neighborhood, therefore the deer are gone, inherently are saying, I believe in top-down regulation. More wolves, less deer, right?